Good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens' weekly webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens. Today, we are going to give you information about an exciting research project that has been happening on the Smithsonian Gardens campus, as well as many other areas around Washington, D.C. I won't tell you anything about it. I get the principles, but the scientists are going to be the ones that are really going to be answering the questions and telling you more about the project. My name is Cindy Brown, and I am the Manager of Education and Collections at Smithsonian Gardens, and we are so glad to have you here with us today. As always, if you would put your questions in the chat box, after the presentation, I will deliver them to the speakers and we'll answer as many as we can before we end today's program. And just a reminder, this is the last program of the series until fall, but we are busy planning another exciting round of speakers for you and presentations, and we hope that you will check on our website to see what speakers we have for the fall and when we start back up again. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marc Rosenfield and Leona Neftaliem. I hope I said that right. Leona, you can correct me. And we're going to talk about this nifty project that looks at carbon emissions and what kind of ideas you can draw from them. So Marc and Leona, I'm leaving everyone in good hands. I'll disappear. I'll be here to help you out, and then I'll come back on at the end of the presentation to be able to answer questions for you. So Marc, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. And Cynthia, I'm so excited to be talking to you and the rest of this audience here about the research I've been doing at George Washington University that has also been sponsored by the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. I will be talking to you about a few projects that are under the umbrella of what I'm calling the techno-ecosphere, where we use novel technologies to understand carbon emissions and ecosystem function. So here's just a general outline of the talk structure. So I'll start by telling you about why carbon is so important. And then we'll go into a project that was started just recently that I am workshopping the title Flux Capacitor. And then I'll talk to you about project 2, which will be the meat and potatoes of this talk, which is about the work that's been done during COVID-19 in our nation's capital. So let's talk about the carbon cycle first. Why do we study carbon? This is because carbon is the fingerprint of life here on Earth. So in these pictures here, I have, to start off, this picture of this redwood, this giant redwood in California. This species is taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and making it solid in the form of biomass. Now, when carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere, it no longer can have a heating effect on the Earth until it returns back to the atmosphere. So that is why in climate change, we talk about why it's so important to have large rates of photosynthesis on our planet. There's also carbon exchanges that can happen between organisms. So in these other 3 pictures, we have a beautiful individual of the monarch family eating this leaf here. We have white rot fungi breaking down this wood, and we have termites breaking down another dead wood in Australia. Now, in this case, we have exchange from organism to organism, but sometimes we also have respiration happening to counteract the photosynthesis. So this tree took in a bunch of carbon and made it biomass, and now much of this carbon is being returned to the atmosphere in the form of CO2 as this fungi here respires. Now this picture on the right is a termite mound that is breaking down this wood. These individuals, the termites, can actually have gut bacteria that produce methane instead of CO2. So methane is produced, which has a 21 times the heating effect of CO2 on our atmosphere. Now, I tell you that because it's not only important to understand where carbon is, what we'll call stocks, where carbon is going, which we'll call flows, but also what form that carbon is coming in. As in a small case example here, methane has a 21 times the warming potential of CO2 in our atmosphere. There's another very important reason why we study the carbon cycle, which many of us may be more aware of, which is climate change. Now, in this graph over on the right, I have data this is from NOAA and the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And this is a very famous graph that has shown that since the industrial era, CO2 is increasing. But even since 1960, CO2 concentrations have increased in the atmosphere by about 30%. Now, you notice this sawtooth shape, but it's always continuously increasing. Now, what's really important to understand, and something you can't really get from this graph, is that CO2 concentrations are not uniform in the atmosphere. So to show you that this is not just across the entire atmosphere, I will show you this video here, and I will point out some specific things. So this is a video of satellite imagery taken since 2006 by NASA. And the red colors are higher levels of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and blue is lower levels of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, there's some things I want to point out here that are very important. First of all, you can see the Amazon quite literally breathing. So that pulsing it happens every day. Now, the reason why is photosynthesis. Plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during the day, and at night they are not photosynthesizing, and thus respiration starts to become the major pathway for carbon. And you can see that quite clearly here. Now, as this date gets into the winter and now the spring, you can see just how high CO2 concentrations are, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's because most of the land mass is in the Northern Hemisphere. Most of the human activity is also in the Northern Hemisphere. The other thing I would like you to keep in mind, and that will become important later in the talk, is that if you look, the directionality of the CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere tends to go towards the east. Now, I'll explain why that's important as we go on. And the final thing is, as we get out of the winter months, now we're into June, plants become photosynthetically active around the Earth again, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, I should say. And you can see the CO2 values go down. So we have a living, breathing Earth. We have very large differences in CO2. But what's very difficult to understand from this global level is what's happening on the local level, on the lower level, because it's very difficult to understand where the sources of these CO2 are from data like this. So in order to find out about data on the ground level, scientists since about the 90s have started developing what we like to call Eddy covariance towers. You often might hear me call them flux towers. This refers to the movement of carbon dioxide when I say flux, or the movement of carbon into different forms. What these towers are is they're large towers that are fit with what we call anemometers, which are wind speed measurements, and they're fit with gas analyzers. So they'll measure CO2, they'll measure sometimes methane, and they'll also measure what we call covariates, or other environmental variates that are going to have an effect on the system. This is temperature, pressure, humidity, and a slew of other things. Now, we can use this method to understand how when wind patterns move carbon dioxide down into the ecosystem, how much carbon that ecosystem takes out, filters out, until it comes back to the sensor. And this can start to give us an idea of what potential photosynthesis has in this particular environment. Now, we have a system with about 900 towers around the world. One of the largest systems is the Ameriflux system, which has 110 Eddy flux towers located across North and South America. Now, what I want you to look at is, though we have good coverage in North America, we don't so much in South America. And also, 110 sensors limits the amount of replication that might happen in any particular area. 110 sounds like a lot, but 110 over the continent is quite sparse. This is what one particular Eddy flux tower may look like. So this particular tower is in French Guiana. Now, you can see that this canopy is, there's a lot going on, but it's quite homogeneous. It's all the same sort of habitat underneath. So this whole, even though this tower might have a really large area that it's measuring, it has a kind of uniform habitat underneath it. However, if we go to coastal systems, like this one that's in Maryland, you can see this red line here that I've notated to give you scale. That's 100 meters. We have a lot of different habitats and ecosystems occurring in a very small amount of time. So in this lower level, we have high tidal salt marshes. In this middle level, we have a transition zone. And in this very high level, we have hardwoods. But we also have pines in this area as well as you get closer to the coast. Now, this is very important to keep in mind because each one of these ecosystems is likely to have a different carbon footprint and a carbon signature. Yet, if we were to have a single flux tower, we would aggregate all of this area into a single value, and we might neglect what's actually happening on the surface of the Earth. So the limitations to our current flux systems is that they have high initial upkeep and upkeep costs. There are a lot of money to build and a lot of money to repair and maintain. There's low replication within any particular location. And they have large spatial footprints, which makes it difficult to understand what the ecology and biology is doing underneath the hood or underneath the footprint of the sensor. The consequences of this are that our models for Earth system models are limited in a lot of ways. So this is a paper taken from Ward et al. 2020, where they do a really, really good job in this figure of showing the difference between what we have in Earth system models and what's actually happening underneath the hood. So in Earth system models, we often binarize land, ocean, and transitions between the land and the ocean, which would be this river. But there's a lot actually going on underneath the hood of the coastal interface. There's upland forests, there's rivers, there's wetlands, there's estuaries, there's high marsh, low marsh. There's all sorts of different things happening in these systems. And by just simply binarizing land and ocean, we might neglect some of the interesting carbon consequences of these areas. So just to sum it up with this quote on the right, despite their relatively small global surface area, vegetated coastal systems sequester roughly 10% of the residual land sink. So very, very important for global climate change and underrepresented in current climate models. So that gets us to the work that I have been doing at George Washington University. I've been lucky to have collaborators that have helped me along the way. And I'll name a few here. So Amy Zan is the principal investigator of my lab. This is us in Alto Paraíso de Goiás in Brazil. Over here is Dr. Karen Gadan, who is a salt marsh specialist who has been instrumental in helping me develop my projects. And Dr. Roy Rich here on the right, who is an incredible engineer and has created incredible sensors that I have used for my projects and developed with him as well. So our CO2 sensors that we've built are Arduino based. They're low cost sensors, what we call a K30 sensor for CO2 and a BME sensor for temperature, pressure, and humidity. They have the ability to log every 4 seconds. We change that depending on what we're interested in. They have a lot lower power requirements, so we can put them off grid, and they're relatively durable, which makes it quite easy for us or easier, that I should say, maybe not easy, but easier to deploy them to more remote areas. So to get us started, to show you some data, we wanted a proof of concept to see if we'd find differences on the landscape. So this is just 3 sensors. It's not really enough to come to any large conclusions, but it could show us that there's something interesting to be said about our system, or our model for calculating carbon emissions. So this is taken in Alto Paraíso de Goiás in Brazil. And this is a what they call the Cerrado, which is a native grassland in this area in the middle of Brazil. And we have set up 3 sensors very close to each other in 3 very different environments. So we have the native habitat here on the right. It's outlined in gray and is gray in the lines here. This is also CO2 on the y-axis and months on the x. So this is just the time series of CO2. We have native Mulundus, which is a raised kind of like pocket of biodiversity in this landscape. So we have like a large tree diversity on top of this little pocket. And we have a sensor on top of this pocket of trees that's in gold. And we have what they call a restored, but is really like a old pasture land that is now invaded by African grasses in the middle here. And you can see even in just like a small area, they're all within about 100 meters of each other. You have very different carbon cyclings happening. So this was just a proof of concept to show, yes, there are differences that happen over small areas that would likely just be aggregated into a single value with a flux sensor. So that gets me to the development of this project. Now, for us 9 scientists in the group, sometimes scientists have a great, easy way of coming up with an acronym. Sometimes we got to shove an acronym in to make it work. So that's what I have here. I've built this, this acronym, working title, Flux in CO2 Atmospheric Pathways Around Coastal Interfaces to Optimize Resolution, or Flux Capacitor. Now, we'll see if that changes. I like it for now. Just a fun little thing. So in our system, we have a pretty diverse gradient. So we work out on the eastern shore of Virginia in an area where sea level rise is quite pronounced. Now, this area has hardwood forests, softwood forests, high marsh, low marsh. It has invaded areas. This is what we call Phragmites australis, a very, very invasive species in this area of the country. And we have transition zones that we call ghost forests. Now, why do we call them ghost forests? Ghost forests are areas where sea level rise in this particular area has killed off coastal forests. And so we have these coastal forests where salinity inundation comes in and kills off massive portions of it. So this is a picture I took out on the eastern shore to just give you some scale. The picture is actually a lot larger than this. This is actually like cut down and cropped. So the problem is quite advanced out there. But though you have all these trees dying off and a carbon source as these trees respire, you also have wetlands moving into these areas, which are really strong carbon sinks. They pull carbon out of the atmosphere at very large rates. So there's a lot of things changing in this area, and they're very unique. So it's interesting to think about what the carbon consequences are going to be for here. So that is the reason why we're doing this project. As of now, we have 25 sensors set up. We have which I've shown in these dots and squares, and we will have 3 anemometers set up across the gradient as well, which will measure wind speed in 3 dimensions, so we can get an idea of how carbon cycles with the wind. This is just a sample data. As I said, we've only had this project going since April, so I'm not going to go to show you anything in the likeness of results, but I will show you just what the data kind of looks like. So here on the left, we have CO2. You can see it kind of increasing and decreasing, temperature increasing and decreasing, pressure, and humidity. And because this isn't the main point of this talk, I'm not going to discuss much of it any further, but I just wanted to thank Rose Cheney and Justice Job for their incredible efforts in helping me set up this enormous project. So now I'm going to move on to the meat and potatoes of this conversation, and this will be the research being done at Carbon in the Capitol. Now, this is the map I just showed you. This was the project that we had just set up this year. However, this project was supposed to be set up in 2020, but the funniest thing happened. The site closed because of COVID-19. So I actually had 25 sensors set up, or I had 25 sensors built, but now we didn't know where to put these sensors because we could not get them set up at this site. However, there was a lot of changes happening in human activity over this period of time. And in the past, large changes of human activity have been really interesting for carbon research. So this is an example taken from the days after 9/11, where there was an air traffic moratorium that occurred for 3 long days without any air traffic. And this researcher, Dr. David Travis, found the largest changes to temperatures in those 3 days that had ever been seen in the previous 30 years. So that's not carbon, but this is weather changes, which are going to have direct effects on carbon. And so, these big changes in human activities that we experience have large impacts for how we, us carbon and atmospheric scientists study our systems. Just like 9/11, we are seeing large changes and perturbations in our area of the woods in DC. Now, what I'm showing you here is data taken from Google Analytics. On the y-axis, we have the change in traffic from the baseline taken from the year before, and we have traffic split up into different areas of the city, so from retail to residential. Now, what you see is right in the early months of the pandemic, right before April and in March, giant changes to human activity. And that is just changing over the course of time. I'll show you an update of this graph later. This is the data that we had in hand when we were building this project. So now I had 25, 27 sensors, and I didn't know where to put them. I had extreme changes to human behavior happening around us. And so I figured this is an interesting thing to study. So we started a citizen science project that was born called Carbon in the Capital. So this is what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this talk. So the new plan was to deploy sensors through the greater metro area of DC. We wanted to cover large amounts of ground that covered different areas with higher levels of maybe urbanization, higher levels of industrialization, and higher levels of parks. And we wanted to cover large socioeconomic status backgrounds. In the best case scenario, we would have every ward of DC represented. And I want to mention that this is ongoing research. So I'm going to show you plenty of data, but I'm not going to show you much in the likes of results. And I want to make that abundantly clear, as these are still coming out. So with that, I'm gonna say we could apply these to all sorts of systems. So we could apply them to social systems. So we take what we've learned in the natural areas and what we've learned from carbon cycling in natural areas, and now we want to apply them to a city and urban landscape. And we want to see how traffic affects these areas and how green spaces affect these areas, along with a slew of other variables. Now I'm going to hand this conversation over to Leona Neftaliem, who's going to describe what it was like for her to start this research project with me and find the volunteers that we needed to get this project done. So take it away, Leona.
Thanks, Mark. So hi, everyone. Quickly before starting with my section, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting us today. So my name is Leona, and I'm a research technician in the Technology and Ecology Lab, led by Roy Rich at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. In my previous research while in undergrad at GW was in sunlight-driven wood decomposition and how that could influence the global carbon cycle in the Zan Lab, which is how I was able to get involved in this project. And I joined this project because I'm very interested in carbon, but also because I'm super interested in the socio-ecological determinants of health. So this project was a great way to get started in that type of research. And like Mark sort of described, my role in the project was finding sites throughout the city, managing communications with volunteers, and generally just keeping track of the state of each sensor throughout the city. So how did we start our citizen science project? So our biggest challenge was expanding throughout the city. To get started, Mark initially made this short flyer describing the project, and we sent that out to GW professors and other friends who sent it out to their friends and so on. And from this, we had a decent number of locations, mostly downtown and in Northwest, but we were really struggling to fill in certain gaps in the city, especially in the Northeast and the Southeast. So to expand out even further, we started reaching out to businesses and nonprofits to capture the city evenly. So when we were reaching out to these organizations, we tried to emphasize the benefits of participating in the project. So it was being able to contribute to relevant scientific research during such a unique moment in history, and also the potential for science outreach using the sensors. And reaching out to these organizations who ended up sharing the project with their own networks really exploded the project because we had so many homeowners reaching out to us in neighborhoods that we were really struggling to reach initially. However, I did put this quote here because it honestly was relatively difficult to find sites. We had some people never respond, say no, or for just like some logistical reasons, we weren't able to house a sensor at their location. But of course, many more people were interested in having a sensor, and it was mainly just being patient and maybe sending out an additional email or two to finally get a response. And this entire effort resulted in 33 sensors distributed throughout the city. So after we deployed all of our sensors, our focus shifted from finding sites to maintaining the sensors and collecting data from them. And there are some sensors that Marc is responsible for collecting data from, but we generally do rely on our volunteers to collect data each month using a data collection form and to also keep track of how their sensor is functioning. So the success of our project really does depend on the dedication of our volunteers. And we're very, very lucky to have such incredibly engaged volunteers. We've even had someone name their sensor before. They call their sensor Cody, so that's been really great to hear. But keeping up this sort of engagement, I think, relies on sharing our data in a digestible way. We didn't just want to be extracting data from people and having them never see the results, because this is a collaboration and we wouldn't have had this coverage of DC without them. So to do that, we started a newsletter for updates and data sharing. So this was our first newsletter in August on the left, and it was just a short update highlighting our sites and an article that the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center wrote about the project. And the newsletter on the right was our second one, and we included data and project updates. But in the future, we're going to be incorporating more data analyses like CO2 by ward, CO2 by income, and et cetera. And here's a map of our sensors distributed throughout the city on the right. And as you can see, we've gotten pretty even coverage of each ward. And on the left, we have a list of our network of universities, museums, et cetera. So some of our most unique sensor locations definitely include the Hyrick House Museum, which is DC's oldest brewery, the 930 Club, the Botanic Gardens, the Smithsonian Gardens, of course, and the Arboretum.
Great, thank you so much, Leona. And it should be mentioned, just a shameless plug here, that Leona is looking to apply for PhD programs at the current moment in socio-ecological related systems. So, and I should say public health. That's the other most important portion that I should be mentioning for Leona here. So what does a daily data look like? And again, I'm just going to show you some data. I'm not going to show you too much in lieu of results and statistics, but I would like to show you just what we're starting to observe here. So in daily data kind of looks like this, well, generally speaking. It doesn't always look like this, but what we often see is high values of CO2 at night, and throughout the day, this starts to decrease, decrease, decrease until we reach the end of the day where it starts to get dark again, and then a spike back up in CO2. So this is attributed to many reasons. So part of that is photosynthesis, but part of that is also many other variables. So it's quite difficult to tease apart the influences of each one of these things. So here on the right, we have humidity, and you can see that clocks quite well with CO2, not always, but quite well. And we have temperature, which clocks with CO2 and inversely related to CO2, but also does seem to have a very strong influence on our data. If we zoom out, this is just data from the Haupt Garden near the Smithsonian Castle. This is just from the month of January. But if you zoom out, we see instantly that things aren't that simple. We have perturbations daily, but those perturbations are easily masked already as soon as we zoom out. We also have these large spikes that occur and anomalies that don't seem to always line up directly with the humidity, temperature, and pressure data, but upon more analysis, we'll be able to understand where the sources of these things are likely coming from. Now, what we will do is we'll take those data and we'll compare them with things happening underneath the surface that are going to be influencing CO2. So in this case, we have photosynthetic capacity. So what I have done in this graph over on the left is I've created via satellite data from Landsat imagery, what we call normalized difference vegetation index, now, or NDVI for short. Now, what this is doing is it's understanding greenness in a sense on the landscape. So areas that are located in green have more photosynthesis happening. Areas that are closer to red have less. And now what's nice about this metric, NDVI, is that it's normalized between 0 and 1. So 0 is no photosynthesis and 1 is like perfect photosynthesis. So it makes it a lot easier for us to understand what's happening on the ground level. You can see the mall in Washington, D.C., because there's a little more photosynthesis happening there than the areas around it. And you can see areas like Rock Creek Park and the Arboretum, which have strong impacts on NDVI clearly. In the dots are going to be locations of my sensors. So what we will do is we'll take these information and we will bind them to the locations of our sensors so that we can understand how NDVI might look for each one of the sensors. And that's what we've done here. So this is a complicated graph, but I'm going to break it down for you. The higher values, the higher colors are areas with high photosynthesis. The areas with red colors are low levels of photosynthesis. And what I've done is I've graphed every single sensor for temperature, or for CO2, temperature, pressure, and humidity. And this is for the month of August 2020. And what you can see is not so much of a pattern that pops out, at least for CO2 or carbon dioxide, but we do see some other interesting patterns. And for that, I'm going to hand it back over to Leona Neftaliem to discuss some potential ways forward in our analyses.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Marc. So the data I'd like to highlight here is the temperature. So you can see that areas with lower NDVI, marked in red, usually have the highest temperatures, meaning that we've been seeing that temperature is almost consistently higher in parts of the city that have less green space. And the differences are up to 5 degrees Fahrenheit or even more on some days. So what does that even mean in a broader context? Well, we do know that the placement of people can drive ecological and evolutionary processes. So much so that there's even an urban phenomenon known as the luxury effect, where we see greater plant diversity in wealthier neighborhoods and inversely significantly less plant diversity in low-income neighborhoods, which can cause higher temperatures from the lack of tree cover and the excess amount of heat-trapping pavement in these neighborhoods. And we're seeing these sorts of inequities manifest every day. So this first article describes how heat is linked to reduced learning globally. But in the US, they found that students who experienced more school days of 80 degrees or hotter during the year performed worse than their counterparts in the same school districts who took the tests in years with fewer hotter days. But that connection was only true for Black and Hispanic students and for students with lower family income, because low-income students tend to be in school buildings that have worse HVAC and ventilation systems. So this next article is similar in that it's also about temperature, but it describes how redlining, the marking of Black neighborhoods as financial risks, has contributed to the excessive heat and poor environmental conditions in present-day communities. So this housing segregation created a snowball effect of environmental damage because these housing inequalities have also influenced urban heat patterns. So neighborhoods with white homeowners had more power when lobbying city governments for more green spaces, but Black neighborhoods were instead targeted by city planners because redlined areas had cheap land for new industries, highways, warehouses, and public housing, leaving little space for vegetation. And we can see this in their data. So this study included 20 cities, and they found that historically redlined neighborhoods were 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than other neighborhoods in the same cities. So, and some cities were even found to have differences up to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're consistently seeing how a mix of poor environmental conditions and poverty can illustrate how global warming can magnify inequality, making particular communities especially vulnerable to global change. And this study didn't include DC. And after seeing this article, I was really interested in finding redlining data for DC to potentially replicate these sorts of analyses. And turns out there is an organization called Mapping Segregation DC, and they have very kindly shared their mapping data with us so that we can also explore how modern day CO2 levels and temperatures may have been impacted by housing segregation in DC. And both of these articles have been helping us severely in crafting our environmental justice lens that we're using to look at these sensor data. And through this lens, we are definitely expecting to uncover environmental inequalities that unfortunately persist in DC, but we're hoping to use these data responsibly to also somehow benefit DC communities.
Thanks, Leona. Now, this is not the only phenomenon that we see with environmental related variables and how city structure tends to form. So in this paper here, it was discussed how in the Northern Hemisphere, and though this study was looking at the UK, the east sides of cities, generally speaking, have lower socioeconomic statuses. And the paper goes on to justify this pattern by saying that the reason might just be that wind is responsible for moving pollution across cities. So if you live on the east side of cities and the wind is moving in your direction, there's a chance that pollution is also coming with that wind. So I was interested in this and how this might affect our data. So just to give you an idea of what DC wind patterns look like, I've put this map in. So this is what we call a wind row. So to read this, we are going to look at the bigger triangles are going to show what direction the wind is going. So it shows where it's coming from. So in other words, this spike is moving in this direction. And the other thing to point out is the size of the triangle shows how many hours we're going to be seeing throughout the year on average in this direction, and the colors are going to show you the composition of the speed of that wind. Generally, as you can see in DC, wind is generally moving towards the southeast. And though, just saying this alone is quite correlative, the east side of our city tends to have areas of lower socioeconomic status. So there's definitely connections between our environment around us and where pollution is going to reside. This is just to mirror that point, the last 2 weeks, 15 days of data collected from windrow data around DC. What you can see is that 10 of the last 15 days had, at least for a good majority portion of the day, some sort of westerly wind, that is wind moving in the east direction. So what about traffic? I've been talking about traffic for a while in the beginning, and I wanted to show this graph to show you where it is now. So the graph I showed you before was right around to this point in the year, but now we have all this data, and we can see that as many of us are likely familiar with right now, traffic is increasing across the Washington, D.C. area, just slightly. It's still not back to normal by any means. But we're also seeing residential patterns change. So we're seeing residential traffic, though it increased in the beginning and is kind of moving around the higher side throughout the year, it's starting to go back down, which is maybe indicative of people going back to work. This is likely to have another effect on our data for CO2, but time will tell as we build our models to what this means. Some other things, if we look at the CO2 data, I just wanted to pull these two graphs out to just show you kind of where our head is at on where we're going to go in our data analysis. So this is two sensors. This one is at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where Leona Neftaliem is currently working. And this one is at the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum, which is located in Washington, D.C., and with a lot more buildings and a lot more traffic located around it. And you can see that the peaks of CO2 are kind of what we'd expect for a natural area for the most part at CERC, where it's high at night as soon as the sun comes down. Besides this little perturbation here, CO2 is coming back down to a lower level. Whereas on the right, where there's more urbanization and more traffic, CO2 values stay elevated for longer and then decrease maybe around noon. And we think this might be due to the 8 a.m. rush hour traffic signal that we might be seeing in the cities that is absent at the Smithsonian. Now, just to reference, I realize that the values of CO2 are higher at Smithsonian than Anacostia. I think the reason for this is that there's canopy cover at our site at the Smithsonian, so it's likely trapping CO2. But I'm really more interested in showing you the perturbations and the cycling that is occurring in these two sites. So that leaves us with our next steps. We want to make models that show CO2 as functions of all of these variables shown below. But one thing I'm really excited about with these data is that we can start to look at higher resolution spatial data of CO2 and then know what kind of stuff that's happening underneath the surface is going to have an effect on CO2. So I think that eventually we'll be able to build some sort of model that compares green spaces to distance to freeways to understand how important building gardens, green spaces, and restorations are for carbon sinks and taking carbon dioxide and scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in urban systems. We also want to look at data in series of time, which is very important, as I was showing you before. We see yearly cycles might be able to get us information on how COVID has affected our data. So like year 2020 versus year 2021 as things start to pop back up. Seasonal data, which is very important for seeing not only biological phenology differences happening over the course of years, but also the difference between urban and rural areas in carbon cycling. Weekly, which is quite interesting because weeks are, in a sense, a human construct. We live our lives off of weeks, but nature generally doesn't. So if we see cycles on a weekly basis, we might be able to glean that that is some kind of anthropogenic signal, which is quite interesting, and daily cycles, as I've been showing you throughout. The ultimate goal is to build a model of CO2 of a fully functioning city that scales across multiple spatial scales, from a local level to a ward level or regional level to a city level, which is one of the major golden questions of ecology as well, is how to scale from local to global or local to regional levels. So our data set might help us come up with some kind of understanding of how to model these sorts of things. And with that, I would like to thank my funding sources, the Irish Endowment and Harlan program at GW, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center for some internal funds, and the Washington Biology Field Club for their contributions to my research. And I would want to thank all of my collaborators and volunteers that are on this list. Thank you so much for listening. I'll take questions now.
Wow. That was a lot. Thank you so very much. I can hardly wait to see what the results are, which you come up with in the reports. In fact, that leads me to my first question. How do we get a subscription to your newsletter that you do that is the CO2 in the capital?
Yes, so currently it's just via email chain. We're doing it with just our volunteers, but we'd love to expand that. So as that develops, I will share it with the Smithsonian Gardens, and
Okay.
we'll make sure to provide some kind of link to understand how our research is going on in the future. I would love to see
Excellent.
more people interested. So that's great.
Excellent. Then we'll put it with your video when we publish that and put that on our website too, so that people will be able to read more about what you find out, because it really is a very interesting topic. And many people are saying, yes, we want that newsletter.
Great.
Who else besides you has worked on a similar project in the United States on measuring CO2 on a more local level rather than just the bigger territory areas?
Now, looking at CO2 on a local level is quite a large group of scientists. So I would say I'm not the only one doing it. I would say that where my project is unique is how I'm going about doing it. So oftentimes scientists on the local level use chambers. So they use like these chambers that will enclose a particular area. So you understand the volume of the system, and then that chamber will be opened periodically to scrub the carbon dioxide out. So when it's closed, we can watch carbon dioxide increase, and then we open it, goes back to normal. So that's what we call flux. My system's a little different because this cheap and low cost sensor development has been quite new in the recent years. So yeah, there are some scientists that are starting to use these K30s. We actually have a GitHub account that shows you how to build them, run by the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and I'm as well contributing to it. If you're interested in learning about that, feel free to reach out. I don't know if we can get email addresses to anyone asking these questions.
We
but
can. If you,
okay.
in fact, if you want that information, please put your email address in the chat and I get that and I can always send information along to Marc and Leona.
That's fantastic. And if you're interested in getting the newsletter as well, you can feel free to send your email, send an email along our way, and we'll make sure you're on it.
Excellent. Another question was, does vegetation type make a difference in the NDVI? Trees versus grass, is there a difference in how much carbon dioxide they're taking up and releasing?
Absolutely. NDVI will work off of an infrared signal from a satellite. So not to go too deep in the weeds, so to speak. The sensor will read passive wavelengths coming back in the form of near infrared, and it will understand, like, it'll make an index based off of near infrared. Now, different species will actually have different spectral signatures that get read into the satellite. So you can see even differences between crops. You can see differences in all sorts of things. And all of these are likely to have an effect on CO2 values. Our current system has limitations in how we've aggregated data on the ground level to understand, like, the global consequences of that. But yes, absolutely, there are differences in how individual plants are going to affect carbon cycling in any particular area of planet Earth.
And I do know several scientists at CERC have been working on something like that. So if you Google that question, you can probably find some of the differences in some of the measurements that they have taken through different types of vegetation. So I know work is going on in that area quite a bit. Have you, the presenters, seen the recent article published on canopy coverage in cities, also related to redlining? If you look at the chat, you can see that the address is also given. So that's something that you can use for your research as well coming up the line. So just more information. We always have engaged citizens with us. Citizen scientists are wonderful to have on board. So
that's
another
wonderful.
one.
Thank you for that article.
Yeah.
Great. Have you and your colleagues considered how American Rescue Plan Act funds can help develop and promote environmental resiliency in some of our most vulnerable neighborhoods and communities? Leona, that might be one you can answer.
Thanks. Okay, so we haven't really discussed any ideas with the American Rescue Plan Act, but we are really concerned with at least disassociating sustainability with gentrification. So if we were able to use this data to benefit communities, we were hoping to somehow not only promote environmental resiliency within communities and cleanups, but also prevent gentrification at the same time, which may be difficult, but that's definitely something that we are interested in.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Chidi for that. That's an act that I actually personally am not familiar with. So that's just another route of analyses I can go down. It's a pretty rich data set, and it's the hope that we get more information like that. So we appreciate it.
Agreed. Boy, we really, all of the raw data that we can get will be able to help us analyze what's going on in our various areas and be able to contribute to this larger conversation, which has become very prevalent recently, a very good thing, which I greatly appreciate. I'm sure you do too for your work. We're just getting confirmation that someone from Kansas City, where she lives, has historically lower income on the east side of the city, and so that was something that they never even thought of. So that's a confirmation that it's happening all over, just like the New York Times article is putting out or printing to go along. So there's lots more work for you to be able to do. So lots of people again are saying, please sign me up for the newsletter. Your newsletter is we're going to have to publish you somehow.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to develop a new way to publish this, so it's not an old janky sort of email chain. Yeah. I appreciate all of the interest, really.
Oh, it is very good. And so another question is anyone in DMV working with carbon capture technologies? Would it be possible to situate CO2 sensors near to the carbon capture sites?
That's an interesting idea. Personally, I'm not familiar with carbon capture technology in DC. I'm certain someone is working on it. I'm sure someone is. It would be really interesting to think about, these the carbon capture and how these sensors could help them. And I've thought about it a little bit. Like it would be interesting to think about what time of day would be best to capture
Mm.
carbon. Like we talked about earlier, how CO2 values tend to be more concentrated at night than during the day, especially since plants are not photosynthesizing. So, if you can kind of go around photosynthesis and use a carbon capture method at night, it's almost like you're allowing you're almost acting as if you are a tree
Mhm.
doing photosynthesis at
Mm,
night,
mhm,
which could be
mhm.
interesting. Now, I say that backing it with almost nothing, and I want to be clear about that. But I think that there are some interesting applications that could be done with these sorts of sensors, and I'm sure it is being done currently.
Isn't it the way it is, though? The more questions you get asked, the more questions you have. So that's great. I mean, it's always good to think multiple steps beyond and opening up ideas. So, what are you hoping? And I'm really curious in this. What are you hoping the results of this research will be able to tell us? Or will it be used for setting baseline measurements for other projects?
I absolutely see it becoming, at least for me personally, potentially like a career-long opportunity. I see using these sensors in various ways in various areas of the globe, for studying carbon cycling and ecosystem function. In terms of the results, I mean, it is quite flashy to talk about carbon in COVID. But what I'm most excited about is thinking about how we can show the importance of green spaces in cities. Um, if we can find a way, as our results and analyses continue, to connect sources on the ground with sinks from parks, we might be able to create some sort of model to show where, if you build a park, how much CO2 will it take out of the atmosphere at any given day, and if that where that park is built, how much of an effect it has on CO2. And I think these are kind of questions that aren't really being talked about as much, just in terms of like playing with space and time in terms of CO2. And I think it could end up being a pretty unique niche and opportunity for me as a researcher.
I think you need to go back to school to go work in the urban planning office too, because this is something that it's wonderful to do the research, but like you said, the practical applications and showing how it can be used to help us plan out our cities a little bit better, a lot better actually, would be great. And Smithsonian Gardens is a big advocate for that. So we know we have the qualitative information. We know how much better it feels to be in the gardens, but it's great to have that quantitative data too, so that we can really show the differences. Okay, more. Pollinator corridor versus empty tree boxes with construction waste. I planted a pollinator corridor along Connecticut Avenue if you want to place more sensors. So there you go. You're getting offers for more places to put more sensors. So as you increase your work in this area, you might want to do that.
That's beautiful. And I thanks for that, Kathy. And I just want to mention at the current moment, we're not looking to put more out, but we will definitely write your information down, if you would like to message us. And I'll make sure, in fact, right now I will share our email address.
Excellent. And while you're doing that, we do have a policy wonk on, and he says, or she says, billions of dollars are available. So make sure you start to grab. You're going to have to hire someone to just look into grant applications for you so that you can continue with this work, which I know is a big part of your project anyway. So you're getting all kinds of information on here. Please follow. I will send you the chat box so that you can see this information and carry on with it and include it in your research and your ongoing career in this field. What a great career. You could stay here, or you could go all over the world and see what's going on. You could go to space to make sure you get some more of those pictures too, which would be incredible. um, I really want to thank you for really bringing more quantitative data to a discussion that we have all the time at Smithsonian Gardens. We are a member of American Public Garden Association, and this topic is high amongst public gardens all over the United States. And we are talking about how to make things more equitable, how to reach out to areas that may need the green spaces more. It's a slow process, and we're appreciative for any help that we get with this type of information so that we can go and talk to our communities and let them know what work is being done. And it's not just a feel-good moment, it's something that has science that is backing it. So thank you for that. Any last words that you'd like to share with, oh, how about doing a presentation at EPA? There you go. That's, I think that would be greatly appreciated by some of the members of EPA.
That'd be wonderful. We've done some talks with the Department of Energy and the Environment and a few other groups. So that would, yeah, I would love to do more. The more I can talk to, the better. I also want to mention that I did put my the email address for this project in the chat. It's covidcitizenscience@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. I look forward to seeing both the data and the social implications, and working together is a terrific way to be able to let us know about that. So I hope you both stay in touch with each other, and Leona, you find a great place to pursue your PhD. I'm going to send you a couple names too. So thank you so much. And like everybody's saying, it's fascinating research and presentation. Good luck with your future endeavors, and I echo that. And I want to say thank you to all of our supporters that have been with us for many, many Let's Talk Garden presentations. And we are very glad that you tune in, and very appreciative of your comments. They help us grow, and they help us share information that you are most fascinated with. So thank you for joining us again. Marc and Leona, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of months. We'll see you in mid-September. Have a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.